Under the stained glass light of St. Helena's Cathedral in Manhattan, Lydia Moore stood trembling in her grandmother's lace gown, waiting to say I do. But before the priest could finish the vows, her fiancé's mother rose and screamed, "This wedding is a fraud!" Whispers rippled through 200 guests. The organ fell silent. Lydia's heart shattered. And then the cathedral doors burst open. A tall man in a black suit strode in, flanked by guards. "I'm taking her," he said calmly. "She's not yours to humiliate. She's my bride, everyone leave now." The city's underworld had just crashed the altar. The scent of white lilies hung thick in St. Helena's Cathedral, almost suffocating in the June heat. Lydia Moore stood at the altar in her grandmother's restored lace gown, the only heirloom she possessed from a childhood spent in foster care. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the bouquet of peonies Richard had insisted upon expensive, beautiful, impersonal. Richard Ashcroft stood beside her in his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, his expression carefully neutral. She had learned to read that look over their 18-month courtship. It meant he was calculating something, weighing outcomes, measuring risks. He was a hedge fund manager. Everything was a transaction. The cathedral held 200 guests, most of whom Lydia had never met. They were Richard's people business associates, country club friends, distant cousins with hyphenated last names. Her side of the church held exactly 7 people. 3 colleagues from Columbia University, where she taught classical literature, 2 former foster siblings, and Mrs. Chen from the corner bookshop who had given her free books throughout high school. Father Benedict was midway through the vows when Margaret Ashcroft rose from the front pew. Richard's mother was a formidable woman, tall, silver-haired, always dressed as if attending a board meeting. Today she wore champagne silk and a pearl choker that probably cost more than Lydia's annual salary. Her voice cut through the sacred space like broken glass. "Stop this ceremony immediately." The organ's soft accompaniment stuttered into silence. Father Benedict looked up, confused. "Mrs. Ashcroft, This wedding is a fraud," Margaret announced, turning to face the assembled guests. Her voice carried the practiced projection of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "This woman has deceived my son and this family." Lydia felt her chest constrict. She couldn't breathe. The gown suddenly felt too tight, the cathedral too small, the eyes of 200 strangers too heavy. "Mother, please," Richard began, but his voice lacked conviction. "Do you know where she comes from?" Margaret continued, addressing the crowd like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Not from the boarding school in Connecticut," she claimed. "She grew up in foster care. 5 different homes, no family name, no inheritance, no connections. She's a scholarship student who saw an opportunity and took it." The words landed like physical blows. Lydia had told Richard everything about her childhood, about the group home in Queens, about the teachers who had helped her win a full ride to Columbia. He had promised it didn't matter. He had said he loved her for who she was, not where she came from. But now he stood silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the altar. "Richard?" Lydia whispered. "Say something." He didn't look at her. The whispers began then, a rustling wave of scandal spreading through the pews. Lydia heard fragments. Gold digger, social climber, knew something was off, her vision blurred. The stained glass windows seemed to spin, their blues and reds bleeding together. Margaret wasn't finished. "My son built his career through discipline and connections. He deserves someone from his own world, someone who understands our responsibilities. Not some opportunist teaching dead languages to children." Lydia's colleague, Professor Harrison, stood up in her small section. "That's enough. Lydia is one of the finest minds in classical studies." "I'm sure she's very clever," Margaret said coldly. "That's precisely the problem. She calculated every step of this relationship." "Mother," that's not Richard tried again, but he still wouldn't meet Lydia's eyes. And in that moment, Lydia understood. He had known his mother would do this. Maybe not the exact timing, but he had known opposition was coming, and he had chosen not to prepare her, not to defend her, not to stand between her and this humiliation. She had been naive to think love could bridge their different worlds. "I need air," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. No one moved to help her. The guests simply stared, drinking in the spectacle. This would be the story they told at dinner parties for years, the wedding that exploded, the girl who reached too high. Lydia turned toward the cathedral's side door, the massive skirt of her gown catching on the altar steps. The sound of ripping fabric seemed impossibly loud, and then the main doors exploded inward. The crash echoed through the cathedral like thunder. Every head turned. 4 men in dark suits entered first, moving with the synchronized precision of military personnel. They positioned themselves at strategic points covering exits, assessing threats, creating a perimeter. Lydia had seen enough movies to recognize personal security when she saw it. Then he walked in. Damian Rossi was not a man who entered rooms, he conquered them. Tall, probably 6'3", with dark hair swept back from a face that looked carved from marble. His suit was impeccable midnight blue, clearly bespoke, with a pocket square that matched nothing because it didn't need to. He wore no tie. 3 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of a silver chain. But it was his eyes that held Lydia frozen dark, intense, and fixed on her with an unsettling certainty. "Who the hell are you?" Richard's voice cracked slightly, his hedge fund confidence evaporating. Damian didn't even glance at him. He walked down the center aisle with measured steps, the crowd parting instinctively. When he reached the altar, he finally spoke, and his voice was quiet but absolute. "You shouldn't be standing with them." Lydia couldn't find her voice. Up close, she could see a thin scar along his jawline, another at his temple. His cologne was cedar and something darker smoke maybe, or leather. Margaret recovered first. "Security. Remove this man immediately. Mrs. Ashcroft." Now Damian turned to her, and something in his expression made the formidable woman step backward. "I suggest you sit down." "How dare you?" "I dare quite easily." He pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, scrolled through it, then held it up so she could see the screen. Lydia couldn't see what was displayed, but she watched the color drain from Margaret's face. "That's," Margaret's voice faltered. "The pending merger between Ashcroft Investments and the Brennan Group," Damian finished calmly. $42 million. "I own Brennan Group. 1 call from me, and the deal dies. Your son's fund loses its 3 largest clients. Your husband's commercial real estate portfolio, the one leveraged against properties I currently hold the mortgages on, becomes worthless." He lowered the phone. "Would you like me to continue?" The silence was absolute. Even Father Benedict seemed too shocked to intervene. Richard found his voice, though it trembled. "You can't just. Who are you?" "Someone who doesn't appreciate watching innocent people being destroyed for entertainment." Damian finally looked at Richard, and his contempt was obvious. "You stood there. You let your mother eviscerate the woman you claim to love. You're not a man. You're a coward in an expensive suit." He turned back to Lydia. "You deserve better than this circus." Lydia's mind raced. She should be afraid this was clearly a dangerous man, someone who wielded power like a weapon. But underneath the shock and humiliation, she felt something else: curiosity. And perhaps, impossibly, recognition. "I don't know you," she managed to say. "No," Damian agreed. "But I know you, Dr. Moore. I know you run the same route along Riverside Park every morning at 6. I know you lecture on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and your students call you the most passionate teacher in the department. I know you volunteer at the Literacy Center on Saturday mornings. I know you once talked a homeless veteran out of walking into traffic by reciting Odysseus's homecoming speech in Greek for 20 minutes until the police arrived." Lydia's breath caught. That incident had happened 6 months ago. She had never told anyone about it, not even Richard. "How? You also," Damian continued, his voice gentler, "stopped a group of boys from tormenting a little girl at the park 2 months ago. You sat with her on a bench and read her a story until her guardian arrived. That girl was my niece, Sophia." The memory surfaced: a small girl with dark curls, crying because older boys had stolen her backpack and thrown it in the fountain. Lydia had chased them off more through indignation than any physical threat, then spent an hour with the child, reading from a book of myths she always carried. "Sophia Rossi," Lydia whispered. "My brother's daughter." Damian extended his hand. "You showed her kindness when you had no reason to. You asked nothing in return. You simply saw someone who needed help. That's what people should do. But they don't." His hand remained steady, waiting. "Come with me, please." "You can't just take her," Richard started. One of Damian's security team stepped forward, and Richard fell silent. Margaret tried once more. "This is kidnapping. This is a rescue." Damian's eyes never left Lydia's, but only if she chooses it. "Dr. Moore, you can stay here and complete this farce of a wedding, or you can walk out those doors with me. Either way, the Ashcrofts will never humiliate you again. I promise you that." Lydia looked at Richard, really looked at him. He was already mentally calculating, she could see it, weighing whether losing her was worth keeping Damian's business connections. The fact that he was calculating it all told her everything. She turned back to the stranger who somehow knew her better than her fiancé did. "If I go with you," she said carefully, "what happens then?" "Then we talk. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere you can breathe." He lowered his hand slightly, making the offer less formal. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm asking you to trust that anything is better than this." He was right. Lydia looked down at her grandmother's gown, now torn and stained with the dirt of Street Helena's steps. She thought about Margaret's words, about Richard's silence, about becoming a cautionary tale for Manhattan's social circuit. Then she thought about the little girl in the park, how Sophia had hugged her when her uncle finally arrived, how Damien had looked at Lydia then with something like reverence. She took his hand. The crowd gasped collectively. Margaret shrieked something about the police. Richard called her name, but she noticed he didn't move to stop her. Damien removed his suit jacket with one smooth motion and draped it over Lydia's shoulders. It smelled like cedar and carried his warmth. Then, with shocking gentleness, he bent and lifted her into his arms, the voluminous gown and all. "Hold on," he murmured. He carried her down the center aisle, past the staring guests, past the security team that fell into formation around them. The cathedral doors swung open to reveal a black SUV waiting at the curb, rear door already open. As Damien settled her into the leather seat and the vehicle pulled away from Street Helena's cathedral, Lydia caught one last glimpse of her almost wedding through the tinted window. Richard stood in the cathedral doorway, phone already to his ear. Margaret was shouting at someone. The guests were flooding out onto the steps, phones raised to capture the scandal. And Lydia began to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that turned into tears, then back to laughter again. "Are you all right?" Damien asked from beside her. "I don't know," Lydia admitted, wiping her eyes. "Ask me in an hour." The SUV merged into Manhattan traffic, carrying her away from the ruins of her old life and toward something she couldn't yet name. The leather seats were cool against Lydia's skin. Her hands had stopped trembling, replaced by an odd numbness that made everything feel distant and dreamlike. The wedding gown's layers of silk and tulle filled half the back seat, creating a barrier between her and Damien, who sat perfectly still, watching the city slide past the tinted windows. They had been driving for 10 minutes before Lydia found her voice. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." Damien's tone was measured, careful. "Where you can think clearly." "That's not an answer." "My residence. A penthouse in Hudson Yards." He turned to face her fully. "There's a guest suite with a lock on the door. You'll have complete privacy. When you're ready to leave, my driver will take you wherever you want to go." Lydia studied him in the dim light of the vehicle. The scar on his jaw was more visible now. Not a clean surgical line, but something jagged, earned through violence. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but she noticed the calluses on his knuckles, the slight thickening that came from repeated impact. "You said you know everything about me," she said. "But I know nothing about you except that you're Sophia's uncle, and apparently wealthy enough to threaten the Ashcrofts. What would you like to know? Start with why you were watching me." Damien was quiet for a moment, considering. "After the incident with Sophia, I had you investigated. Standard security protocol, anyone who has significant contact with family members gets vetted." "Investigated how?" "Background check, financial records, professional history, daily patterns." He must have seen her expression because he added, "I needed to know if you were a threat. And you're a 29-year-old associate professor with student debt, a rent-controlled apartment in Morningside Heights, and a tendency to give money to street musicians. You're not a threat. You're—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Genuine. It's rare." Lydia should have been angry about the invasion of privacy. Instead, she felt oddly hollow. "So you've been watching me for 2 months." "Not personally. But I received weekly reports." "Why?" "Because Sophia talked about you constantly. The nice lady who read her stories about heroes coming home. She asked if she could find you again, thank you properly." Damien's voice softened slightly. "My brother arranged for her to join your Saturday literacy program. She's been attending for 6 weeks. The little girl with the backpack." Lydia hadn't connected her to the incident in the park. Children changed so much, and Sophia had been upset that day. But now she remembered. The quiet girl who always chose books about Odysseus, who asked thoughtful questions about the meaning of Nostos. "She never mentioned her uncle," Lydia said. "I asked her not to. I wanted you to interact with her naturally, without knowing our connection." He shifted in his seat. I wanted to understand what kind of person you were when you thought no one was watching. And then you found out I was engaged. Yes, to someone you could destroy financially. The Ashcrofts were already on my radar. Richard's fund manages money for several families I do business with. When I learned you were marrying into that world, he trailed off. Lydia's chest tightened. You investigated him too. Thoroughly. And? Damien met her eyes. He was never going to defend you. His mother has controlled every major decision in his life since his father's death. The wedding was her compromise. She initially wanted him to marry Caroline Hendricks, the governor's daughter. You were always temporary, even if he didn't admit it to himself. The words should have hurt, but Lydia had already suspected as much. You could have told me before the wedding. Would you have believed me? A stranger claiming your fiancé was a coward? Damien shook his head. You needed to see it yourself. I'm sorry it happened publicly. That wasn't my intention. Then what was your intention? The SUV turned onto the West Side Highway, the Hudson River glittering in the afternoon Sunday. Damien was quiet for a long moment before answering. Sophia told me something last week. She said you taught her that Penelope waited 20 years for Odysseus, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to know what was worth waiting for. He looked at Lydia with an intensity that made her breath catch. I realized I had been waiting too, not for 20 years, just 2 months, waiting to see if you would walk down that aisle, or if some part of you would recognize the mistake. You gambled on me backing out? No. I gambled on you deserving better. He leaned forward slightly. When Margaret stood up, I gave you 30 seconds to see if Richard would defend you. He didn't, so I did. Lydia's mind was reeling. You don't even know me. I know that you read Greek poetry to a homeless veteran for 20 minutes in the rain. I know that you buy coffee for your teaching assistant even though you can barely afford it. I know that you cried reading the final pages of the Odyssey to Sophia because reunion stories still move you, even after teaching them for years. His voice dropped lower. I know that Richard never asked about your childhood, never met your foster siblings, never attended one of your lectures. He loved the idea of you but never actually saw you. The truth of it settled in Lydia's chest like a stone. So what? She asked, her voice harder than intended. You saw me from a distance and decided to play hero? No. Damien held her gaze. I saw you and decided to stop letting people like the Ashcrofts destroy people like you just because they can. The SUV slowed, turning into an underground garage. Through the window, Lydia could see gleaming concrete and discreet security cameras. We're here, Damien said. Last chance to choose a different destination. Lydia looked down at her ruined wedding gown, then at the man who had carried her out of her own disaster. She thought about going back to her apartment, facing the whispers and the scandal alone. She thought about Richard's silence, Margaret's cruelty, the 200 witnesses to her humiliation. Then she thought about Sophia asking what Nostos meant, and Lydia explaining that it wasn't just homecoming, it was the courage to return changed. I'll go up, she said. But I want answers. Real ones. You'll get them. Damien opened his door as the SUV stopped. I promise you that. He extended his hand again, and this time, Lydia took it without hesitation. The elevator rode smoothly to the 42nd floor, silent except for the whisper of machinery. Lydia watched the numbers climb, her hand still in Damien's, though neither acknowledged it. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse, her breath caught. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River and the New Jersey skyline beyond. The space was vast but not cold, dark hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves filled with what looked like actual read books, rather than design props. Furniture that was clearly expensive but also clearly used. A grand piano stood near the windows, sheet music scattered across its surface. What struck Lydia most was how lived in it felt. This wasn't a showpiece apartment. Someone actually existed here. The guest suite is through there, Damien said, gesturing to a hallway. There's clothing in various sizes. My sister-in-law stays here occasionally. Bathroom is stocked. Take whatever time you need. Lydia nodded, but didn't move. She was staring at the bookshelves. Even from across the room, she could make out titles. The Iliad in 3 different translations. Plato's Republic. Dante's Inferno with commentary notes visible between pages. You read Italian Renaissance philosophy, she said. My grandfather insisted. He believed that men who build empires should understand how they fall. Damien followed her gaze. Sophia mentioned you were teaching a course on classical tragedy's influence on modern literature. I've been working through your suggested reading list. He pointed to a stack on the coffee table. Lydia recognized her own syllabus. He had clearly been serious about the research. Why? The question came out more vulnerable than she intended. Because understanding what you love helps me understand you. He said it simply, as if it were obvious. Something in Lydia's chest loosened slightly. She walked to the windows, the absurd gown rustling around her. From this height, Manhattan looked almost manageable, a grid of lights and movement, comprehensible from a distance. I need to know what this is, she said to the glass. What you want from me. Protection, Damien answered immediately. She turned. I don't understand. He moved to the piano, running his fingers absently over the keys without pressing down. My world isn't like yours, Lydia. I'm involved in businesses that, let's say, they operate in gray areas. Import-export, real estate development, private security. I've made enemies. Some of them would love to find a weakness they could exploit. And I'm supposed to be that weakness? No. You're supposed to be my armor. He looked up from the piano. Marry me. A real marriage, at least publicly. You become Mrs. Rossi, which means you're untouchable. No one will dare approach you, threaten you, or use you against me. And in return, you get my protection, my resources, and the freedom to live your life without interference. Lydia stared at him. You're insane. I'm practical. You can't just, we don't know each other. Marriage isn't a business contract. In my world, it frequently is. Damien left the piano and approached, stopping a respectful distance away. I'm not asking you to love me, Lydia. I'm asking you to be strategic. You've just had your reputation destroyed in front of Manhattan society. The rumors are already spreading. I guarantee you'll be trending online within the hour. Your career at Columbia will become complicated. She wanted to deny it, but he was right. Academia was vicious about scandal, especially for women without family connections to fall back on. But, Damien continued, if you marry me, the narrative changes. You didn't run away from a wedding in shame, you walked away from a man who didn't deserve you, and chose someone who did. You're not a social climber. You're someone sought after by one of Manhattan's most private, most powerful families. The Ashcrofts become the joke, not you. It was manipulative, calculated, and absolutely correct. How long? Lydia asked. 1 year. We'll sign a contract. After 12 months, if you want to leave, we divorce quietly. You keep whatever assets I transfer to you enough to pay off your student debt, buy a home, fund your research. You walk away secure. And if I want to leave before a year, same deal. The year is my request, not a prison sentence. Lydia moved to the bookshelves, buying time to think. Her fingers traced the spine of the Odyssey, the Robert Fagles translation, her favorite. Someone had made notes in the margins in tight, precise handwriting. What do you get out of this? She asked. Honestly? Damien's voice was closer now, though he hadn't moved. Time with someone who sees the world differently than I do. Sophia tells me you believe stories matter because they teach us how to be human. I've spent 15 years learning how to be powerful. Maybe you can remind me how to be human. It was the most honest thing he'd said yet. I have conditions, Lydia heard herself say. Name them. She turned to face him. First, this arrangement is professional, not personal. Separate bedrooms. No expectations of anything intimate. Agreed. Second, I continue teaching. My career isn't negotiable. I would never ask you to give it up. Third, I want access to your world. If I'm going to live in it, I want to understand it. No secrets, no sanitized version. You show me who you really are. That gave him pause. It's not pretty. I'm a scholar of tragedy. I'm familiar with the worst of human nature. A slight smile crossed his face. All right. And in return, you'll help me understand yours. Meaning? Teach me. Greek literature, philosophy, whatever matters to you. Show me what you see when you read these stories. He gestured at the bookshelves. I'll show you my empire. You show me how empires fall. Fair trade. It was completely insane. Logical, in a twisted way, but insane. Lydia looked around the penthouse at the river view, the books, the piano, the space that somehow felt more like home than Richard's sterile apartment ever had. She thought about walking back into her old life, damaged and alone. She thought about Margaret's cruelty, Richard's silence, the viral video that was probably already racking up views. And she thought about Sophia, asking what Nostos meant, and Lydia's answer. It's the courage to return home changed, stronger, ready to fight for what matters. 1 year. she said firmly. 1 year, Damien confirmed. I want it in writing. A real contract, reviewed by my lawyer. I'll have my attorney draft it tomorrow. He extended his hand formally. Deal? Lydia looked at his hand-scarred knuckles. Steady grip, the hands of someone who had fought for everything he owned. Then she looked at his face, searching for deception or cruelty. She found only careful honesty, and something that might have been hope. She shook his hand. Deal. Then welcome to the family, Mrs. Rossi. The name should have felt foreign. Instead, it felt like armor. The contract arrived the next morning via courier, 47 pages of legal precision that Lydia's lawyer reviewed with increasing astonishment. Everything Damien had promised was there, with additions she hadn't expected. Full access to his financial advisors, a monthly discretionary allowance that made her student debt look laughable, health insurance that covered experimental treatments, and a clause stating that if anything happened to him, she would inherit enough to never worry about money again. This is the most favorable prenup I've ever seen, her lawyer said over the phone. Usually these contracts protect the wealthy party. This one protects you almost exclusively. He's not worried about me taking advantage of him, Lydia murmured, staring at the clause that granted her ownership of a townhouse in the West Village after the year ended, regardless of circumstances. Then he's either a fool or genuinely cares about your well-being. Lydia thought about Damien carrying her from the cathedral, his jacket warm over her shoulders. Maybe both. She signed on the 3rd day. They married on the 4th, a private civil ceremony at City Hall with Sophia as their only witness. The little girl wore a yellow dress and held a bouquet of daisies, grinning as if she'd orchestrated the whole thing herself. You're really my aunt now? Sophia asked afterward, clutching Lydia's hand. I suppose I am. Good. Uncle Damien needs someone who reads books. That night, Lydia stood in the master, sweet her sweet now, and tried to process the fact that she had married a stranger out of strategic necessity. The room was beautiful. King bed with soft gray linens, another wall of bookshelves, a reading nook with a view of the river. Her few possessions from the Morningside Heights apartment looked lost in the space. A knock at the door. Come in. Damien entered carrying 2 glasses of wine and a leather-bound book. He'd changed from the suit he'd worn to City Hall into dark jeans and a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. It was the most casual she'd seen him. Peace offering, he said, handing her a glass, and a question. Which is? He held up the book, her annotated copy of the Odyssey, which she'd thought was lost in the chaos of leaving her old apartment. You left this at the literacy center. Sophia rescued it for you. She said you write better notes than any professor she's had. She's 10. Precocious 10. Damien sat in one of the reading nook chairs, leaving the other for her. She also said you were going to start book 16 this week, where Odysseus finally reveals himself to his son. I thought, given our unusual circumstances, we might read it together. Lydia lowered herself into the other chair, cradling the wine. You want me to teach you Greek literature on our wedding night? I want to understand what you see in it. He opened the book carefully, finding the marked page. Sophia says when you read, you make the characters feel real. Like they're not ancient heroes, but just people trying to get home. That's what they are. Then show me. So Lydia read, translating the Greek as she went, explaining the nuances that English couldn't quite capture. She described how Odysseus chooses to reveal himself to Telemachus not through grand declaration but through tears, how 20 years of separation and survival could be contained in that moment of recognition. Nostos, Damien said quietly when she paused. Sophia's favorite word. Because it means more than homecoming. It means returning transformed, carrying your journey with you, becoming worthy of the home you left. Lydia looked up from the book. Why did you really want to read this? Damien set down his wine glass, his expression turning serious. My father used to say that men who build empires should know how they fall. He made me read history, philosophy, tragedy, said power without wisdom was just violence with better furniture. Was he right? He was murdered when I was 19. Damien's voice was flat, emotionless in the way that revealed deep emotion beneath. Shot outside our family restaurant in Brooklyn by a rival organization. My older brother, Marco, took over the business. I was supposed to go to law school, but you didn't. I couldn't. Marco needed help, and I was good at the work better than I wanted to be. Strategic thinking, reading people, understanding leverage. Turns out a classical education is excellent training for organized crime. He smiled without humor. The Odyssey was the last book I finished before my father died. I haven't been able to read it since. Lydia understood then. Because Odysseus makes it home and your father didn't. Because I became the monsters Odysseus fights, not the hero. She closed the book gently. You know that's not how the story works. Odysseus does terrible things to get home, kills the suitors, tricks the Cyclops, sacrifices his men to Scylla. The question isn't whether he's a monster. It's whether he can live with what he's become. And can he? He tries. That's what makes him human. Lydia met his eyes. You pulled me out of my disaster, Damien. Whatever else you've done, you did that. They sat in silence, the city lights reflecting off the river below. Somewhere in that quiet, something shifted between them, not attraction exactly, but recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to survive in worlds that didn't want them. Will you keep reading? Damien asked eventually. So Lydia did, her voice filling the space between them with ancient words about fathers and sons, homecoming and transformation, the long journey back to becoming human again. When she finally stopped, hours later, Damien was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Thank you, he said. For what? For reminding me that monsters can still read poetry. Lydia smiled despite herself. That's the first step in the redemption arc. Is that what this is? Redemption? Maybe. If you're willing to work for it. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Then I suppose you're stuck teaching me. 1 year, she reminded him. 1 year, he agreed. But something in his tone suggested neither of them quite believed it anymore. Columbia University's campus felt different when Lydia returned the following Monday. Or perhaps she was the one who had changed. She walked through the gates at 116th Street wearing a new wardrobe, still professional, still her style, but with the subtle quality that came from actual budgets and expert tailoring. Damien's stylist had been horrified by her previous collection of thrift store blazers. The whispers started immediately. Lydia pretended not to notice the clusters of graduate students who fell silent as she passed, or the way Professor Hammond from the economics department actually stopped mid-stride to stare. By the time she reached her office in Philosophy Hall, she'd counted at least 20 phones pointed in her direction. Her teaching assistant, Meredith Park, was waiting in the hallway, coffee in hand. You're famous, Meredith said without preamble. Also, Dean Waterston wants to see you. Immediately. Of course he does. Lydia took the coffee gratefully. How bad is it? Depends. Do you consider 3 million views on a video titled Professor Runs from Altar into Arms of Mysterious Billionaire bad? Lydia closed her eyes. 3 million. And climbing. The internet is divided. Half think you're a romance heroine. The other half think you're a calculated opportunist who traded up. Meredith paused. For what it's worth, I'm team romance heroine. I appreciate that. Also, your 2 o'clock lecture is at capacity plus 50 auditors. Apparently everyone wants to see the professor who married a mafia boss. Lydia's coffee suddenly tasted bitter. He's not. She stopped. What exactly was Damien? It's complicated. Isn't it always? Meredith studied her carefully. Are you okay? Really? It was the first time anyone had asked that question since the cathedral. Lydia felt something in her chest loosen slightly. I think so. Ask me again in a few months. Dean Waterston's office was exactly as Lydia remembered: leather furniture. Walls lined with awards and photos of the dean with various politicians and donors. A faint smell of expensive cigars despite campus smoking policies. The dean himself was less friendly than usual. Dr. Moore. Sit. Lydia sat, keeping her spine straight. She'd faced harsher critics during her dissertation defense. I'm sure you're aware, Waterston began, that your recent personal situation has created considerable attention for the university. I'm aware. Some of our donors have expressed concern. Questions about the appropriateness of a faculty member being associated with someone of Mr. Rossi's reputation. What reputation would that be? Waterston had the grace to look uncomfortable. He's known to be involved in various business ventures that are ethically ambiguous. He's a businessman. Import-export, real estate development, private security. All legal enterprises. Lydia kept her voice level. Unless you have evidence of criminal activity, I suggest you avoid defamatory speculation. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps a temporary leave of absence would be appropriate, until the media attention dies down. There it was. Lydia had expected this, but it still stung. No. Waterston blinked. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not taking a leave of absence because I made an unconventional personal choice. My private life has no bearing on my ability to teach classical literature. She leaned forward slightly. Unless you're suggesting that marrying someone wealthy is grounds for dismissal? Because I can think of at least 8 faculty members whose spouses are wealthier than mine. Should they also take leaves? This is different. How? Because the wedding was public? Because it made good gossip? Lydia's voice hardened. Or because I don't come from money, and people like you are uncomfortable when people like me refuse to stay in our assigned places. Waterston's face reddened. Dr. Moore, I understand you've been through a difficult experience. Then stop adding to it. I'll be teaching my 2:00 lecture. If any donors have concerns, they're welcome to attend and evaluate my competence themselves. She stood, preparing to leave. Lydia. Waterston's voice had softened. I'm trying to protect you. The scrutiny will be intense. I know, but hiding isn't the answer. She met his eyes. I spent my childhood being invisible, being shuffled between homes because I wasn't convenient. I'm done disappearing because other people are uncomfortable. Back in her office, Lydia had 30 minutes before class. She spent them reviewing her lecture notes, trying to recapture the passion that usually carried her through teaching. The material was solid. A comparative analysis of homecoming narratives in the Odyssey and modern literature, but her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers. A text from Damien. How's your first day back? She typed. Interesting. Dean suggested I take a leave of absence. His response was immediate. Want me to have a conversation with him? No. I handled it. I don't doubt that. Dinner at 7? I'll cook. You cook? Badly. But enthusiastically. Despite everything, Lydia smiled. The lecture hall was packed. Every seat filled. Students sitting in the aisles. At least 20 people standing in the back. Lydia saw several faces she didn't recognize, probably media, or simply curious onlookers hoping for drama. She set her notes on the podium, took a breath, and began. Today we're discussing Nosto's homecoming, and what it means to return to a place after you've been fundamentally changed by your journey. Odysseus spends 20 years trying to get back to Ithaca, but when he finally arrives, he finds he can't simply walk through the door and resume his old life. He has to prove himself. He has to fight. He has to decide whether the home he remembers still exists, or if it's just a story he told himself to survive. She looked up at the sea of faces, some genuinely interested, others clearly waiting for her to crack. I think we all understand that feeling, she continued. That moment when you realize you can't go back to who you were, even if you wanted to. That the journey has marked you in ways that are permanent. The question isn't whether you can return unchanged, you can't. The question is whether you're brave enough to return anyway and fight for the home you need, even if it's not the home you left. For the next 50 minutes, Lydia taught with everything she had. She deconstructed passages, drew connections to contemporary literature, challenged her students to think beyond the obvious interpretations. She was brilliant and passionate and absolutely in control. When the lecture ended, the applause was genuine, not just polite academic acknowledgement, but real appreciation. As students filed out, several stopped to thank her. Meredith gave her a subtle thumbs up. Even a few of the unfamiliar faces in the back looked impressed. Professor Elena Harrison from the literature department caught Lydia in the hallway. That was masterful, Elena said. I've been teaching here 20 years and I've rarely seen a room that engaged. Thank you. Also, for what it's worth, you did the right thing walking out of that cathedral. Richard Ashcroft is a spineless mediocrity with good hair. You deserve better. The casual support nearly broke Lydia's composure. I appreciate that more than you know. Walking across campus toward the subway, Lydia checked her phone. 3 messages from former foster siblings offering support. 2 from Literacy Center volunteers asking if she was okay. 1 from Sophia, consisting entirely of heart emojis and a photo of the book they'd been reading. And 1 from Richard. Can we talk, please? Lydia deleted it without responding. On the train back to Hudson Yards, crushed between commuters and tourists, she thought about what she'd told her students. About returning changed. About fighting for the home you need rather than the home you left. When she walked into the penthouse, Damien was in the kitchen, swearing at something on the stove. He looked up when she entered, concern immediate on his face. How bad was it? Survivable. She dropped her bag on the counter. You were right about the scrutiny. Did Waterston try to force you out? He tried. I declined. She peered at the smoking pan. What are you attempting to make? Carbonara. It's going poorly. Lydia couldn't help but laugh. This powerful man who could threaten hedge fund managers was defeated by pasta and eggs. "Let me help," she said, moving to his side. "You sure? This is supposed to be me taking care of you. Trust me. Preventing a kitchen fire counts as taking care of me." They cooked together in companionable chaos, and somewhere between rescuing the carbonara and opening a bottle of wine, Lydia realized that her first day back had been painful but survivable. The gossip would continue, the scrutiny wouldn't disappear overnight, but she had proven to herself more than anyone that she could stand firm. Over dinner, Damien asked about her lecture, and she found herself explaining the nuances of Nostos with the same passion she'd brought to the classroom. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, genuinely interested in the ancient poetry that had shaped her worldview. "You're good at this," he said eventually. "At teaching? At being yourself, regardless of what people think. It's rare. I had to learn it. Survival skill from being the scholarship kid." She met his eyes. "What about you? Did you always know how to command a room?" "No. I learned by watching my father, then by making mistakes." He refilled her wine glass. "Still making them, actually. Like marrying a woman you barely know? Like thinking 1 year would be enough time to understand you." The words hung between them, not quite a confession, not quite a promise, but something that made Lydia's heart skip regardless. She raised her glass. "To surviving our first day." Damien touched his glass to hers, to many more. And despite the chaos of her life, despite the uncertainty of their arrangement, Lydia found herself hoping he was right.